This week on the Communicators, a discussion on how digital media, copyright policy, and Google are affecting the publishing industry. Our guest is Richard Sarnoff of the media company Bertelsmann Incorporated.
Well, this week on the Communicators, Richard Sarnoff, who is co-chairman of Bertelsmann, and he's also president of Bertelsmann's Digital Media Investments. Joining in the questioning, Greg Piper of Washington Internet Daily. Mr. Sarnoff, if you could, just start off by giving us a brief snapshot of the Bertelsmann companies.
Sure. Bertelsmann is a major media company based in Germany. Our key divisions are in television, that's broadcast television and television production, where we're the largest broadcaster in Europe with brands like RTL and M6 in France, Channel 5 in Great Britain. We're very active in the magazine field. We're the largest magazine publisher in Europe as well. The key brand there, the umbrella brand, is called Gruner & Jahr. We have a very large services company called Arvato, which provides all kinds of media services from the reproductions of DVDs, all the way to printing of books, to electronic payment services for Google and Microsoft and others. And then last but not least, in the US, we have businesses such as Random House, which is the world's largest consumer book publisher, based here in New York, actually. And Arvato has a number of printing and other servicing concerns here in the US. And of course, we have Fremantle Media, which is one of the producers of American Idol and other television shows here. So we have quite a spread of different media, and it's one of the larger media conglomerates in the world with north of $20 billion.
And you were former vice president, executive vice president of Random House.
Yep.
What is your role and what kind of investments do you look for as president of Bertelsmann's Digital Media Investments?
Well, Bertelsmann Digital Media Investments, which we call BDMI, so it's not such a mouthful, looks for mostly early stage investments in the kinds of businesses that will affect our core businesses over time. So to give you an example from the publishing side, some years ago, we invested in a company called Audible, which had pioneered the digital downloading of audiobooks as opposed to cassettes or CDs, so that people could enjoy them in devices that played things like MP3s. And that business was a pioneer there and ended up being the largest customer for our own audiobook business, which we're the largest audiobook producer in North America. And that kind of business, as we saw it develop, gave us an idea of how to expect developments in the digital realm overall for Random House. The same thing applies for RTL and broadcast television, for Fremantle and television production, for Gruner & Jahr in magazines, and for Arvato in services. So we try to make investments, and we have about 15 portfolio companies now, that can be lighthouse investments, that can kind of show the way forward for some of our core businesses. Many times there'll be close connections where there'll be a supplier relationship or a content relationship or a distribution relationship with our core division and these smaller innovative companies. But in any case, if these companies are successful, they'll show us something about how these markets will develop and how the digital media will be affecting these markets in the future.
Do you foresee a day when we move away from paper and television sets and 20th century technology such as that?
I do foresee a day. That day is today. I don't think there's any question that people's habits of media have changed substantially even in the last 5 years, so that your kids and certainly mine are just as comfortable watching a television program on their computer as they are on a television set, whether it's through Hulu or YouTube or any variety of things they can find on the internet. The same thing is true with Amazon's Kindle and Sony's Reader and a variety of reading devices, including the iPhone now, where people are getting comfortable reading full books on screen. And this kind of behavior is certainly fascinating in how it's mapping the changes of our culture overall. But it's also, fairly concerning to major media companies, because as things switch to digital, there is the danger that a lot of value can leak out of the industry, and that our authors or our artists won't have enough revenues there to pay for their best work, and that we won't have enough revenues to pay for our own infrastructure. And you need look no further, for example, than the music industry, which over the last 10 or 15 years, the recorded music industry has really declined quite precipitously as the electronic dissemination of music, whether legally or illegally, has created a market quite a bit smaller than the former market in, in the CD, cassette, and before that LPs. Same thing is true in the newspaper business. For example, if you look at where newspapers are today versus where they were perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, their revenue model is under serious threat from internet advertising being somewhat more effective and news being commoditized digitally so that people are not reliant on the newspaper every morning for the consumption of news. In many cases, they've consumed it already online. And that industry has not figured out the right revenue model yet to kind of recover its economic position in such a way that it can sustain itself. That's why you've seen a lot of major newspapers already succumbing to this particular economic circumstance. What we're trying to do at Bertelsmann is to make sure that the media that we are most closely involved with don't suffer that same fate. And we were in the music business until fairly recently, and we had a first-hand ringside seat of what that fate actually means.
Well, Mr. Sarnoff, isn't there a whole generation of folks growing up expecting free music, free television, free newspapers, or free information online, that it's going to be hard to kind of corral that back in?
Well, I think consumer expectations and consumer habits are at the core of everything that we do and everything we discuss for the future. And there's no question that consumers, as of this point, have gotten inured to certain levels of free content for music in many cases, for news in almost every case, except perhaps the Wall Street Journal. And that has led to a kind of self-reinforcing behavior where the industry really could not adapt because you really can't compete with free. In other industries, it's not yet decided. So, for example, in the book industry, we find enormous numbers of people that are interested in buying books legitimately and reading them on their Kindle device or even their iPhone, and are finding the same kind of benefit from that experience that they have when they buy books physically in bookstores. And we don't necessarily see that industry transforming into the kind of piracy-oriented atmosphere that we might have seen in the music space. In television, the model is not yet broken at all. We still have a robust broadcast television atmosphere in this country and other countries, and advertising, on network television is still, although it's not perhaps at its highest, it's still an enormous business. And it's not clear whether flanker brands such as Hulu and others that you can see will become more prevalent or will simply ride along with the core broadcast business over time. I think there is an expectation that television will be free, but at the same time, if you look at the cable penetration in North America, you can see 80% of households pay a fair amount per month for their television. So there are different models that you can apply to get economics into a business, only one of which is you pay each time you want to watch something, or you pay each time you want to read something, or you pay each time you want to listen to something. Another one is a subscription model such as cable has, which is you pay all-you-can-eat type of payment every month, and you watch as much as you want. Or for a music subscription, you listen as much as you want. It could be in the future there'll be a book subscription and you read as much as you want. Although I think that's somewhat more doubtful.
Why?
Well, the book business has some special characteristics. I can go into them briefly. The first is that the cohort, the audience that consumes books is perhaps as broad as any that you can find. It goes from age 0 to age 99 through every kind of walk of life. They like different kinds of books, some religious books, some nonfiction, self-help, some fiction, literary, mass market, etc. There's just a huge variety, which means that spectrum that we have in publishing also means that it's somewhat slower to change radically as the music business did, which had more or less a single cohort, let's call it 15 to 25-year-olds. And so the audience changed and the taste changed fairly rapidly, and trends could reinforce themselves with that audience much more easily. The second reason that books are different, and this is also not a subtle reason, is that the reading of books on devices is going to be a kind of slow transition over many, many years in this country and other countries. Hasn't really even started in other countries. And that is because, as I've certainly heard a lot of times, there are a lot of devices, when you read on them, it's like looking into a flashlight. You'll get some eye strain that's a lot more significant than the eye strain you get from a normal page, which has almost optimal clarity and contrast. Many of the reading devices coming out now use a kind of e-ink screen that has very, very low eye strain, but also not the same kind of contrast, so that you need decent light to read it in. Also, people like to have books. It's a very sticky medium. You've seen this medium obviously be sticky since about the 15th, 16th centuries. And there are a lot of psychological reasons for that, one of which is, I find books are the intellectual furniture of your life, and when you move, you tend to move with that intellectual furniture. When you read something great, you want it to be a kind of heirloom product for you personally. And when you have digital media, it's harder for that to be true. You can't actually be proud of a bookshelf that is a memory stick, and no one can see what the intellectual furniture of your life is in there very easily. So I do think we're going to have a very, very long hybrid period where there'll be an awful lot of reading electronically, there already is, and there'll be an awful lot of reading in print. The difficulty for the book publishing industry is that we have to support both simultaneously for a long time, and that can get expensive.
Well, what's the risk of the book publishing industry turning into the music industry insofar as you may be reliant on one dominant provider, just as they have had a very uneasy relationship with Apple for iTunes, which very tightly controls pricing and the terms of use? And the music industry has tried to create alternatives to iTunes to create some competition there. Are you at all afraid that Amazon or perhaps another company that's come up like Scribd, which now has its own e-commerce store for selling even book chapters, is going to become a dominant player and really put terms on you that you're not going to be comfortable with, and you're going to find yourself for the next 5 to 10 years trying to get out of this kind of monopoly relationship?
Well, it's a fair question. We're in a different situation from where the music industry is. Although Amazon is a very strong player, today in digital reading in general, electronic books, we also see a number of other strong players as current or potential competition, and we think it'll be a vibrant, competitive atmosphere.
Such as who?
Such as, we can start with Sony, which is already out with its device and has a fair amount of installed base of digital readers. Then you go right to Apple, which with the iPhones, as a fairly well-distributed medium, people are starting to read on that medium. I think you'll find enormous numbers of other cell phones over time become reading devices, as they have, for example, in Korea and Japan.
But do you think they really have the same
and I'm
popularity,
not done yet.
though? Sorry.
And I'm not done yet. We have Google waiting in the wings, perhaps. We have other consumer electronics companies that may see this as a vibrant enough market. And then we have one other thing that's important here, which is in music, there had been standardized pricing for a really long time. In other words, when you guys were buying LPs, when you were perhaps growing up, not that you're that old, or more recently when you were buying CDs, they tend to have a very, very narrow band of pricing that they were priced at by the industry. Singles, whether those were iTunes singles or before that singles that were playing on fixed media, also had very, very uniform pricing. So when iTunes came out with a 99-cent price point for a single track, that ended up sticking fairly quickly and becoming quite standardized. In the book business, we don't really have a history of that. If you look at hardcovers, they might be $25. Paperbacks might be $14. You'll find mass markets at $8. Children's books, perhaps, at $4 or $5, or up to $15 for illustrated books. And we have pricing, if you walk into a bookstore, that is truly all over the map. Now, we may have some condensation of pricing, but I don't see the uniformity of pricing, and therefore, I'm somewhat less concerned, although still generally concerned about pricing, but somewhat less concerned that we are going to be locked in by a single competitor to a single price point as the music industry has been.
Well, you said today at the World Copyright Summit, where you were speaking, that that you saw some consolidation around maybe a price point of $10 for books, let's say, coming through Kindle. Is there any reason to think that consumers won't get used to a lower priced book, just as they've gotten used to a much cheaper music single or album, which have gone down from, let's say, the highs of $18 in CDs down to about maybe $10 through iTunes? I mean, how much control do you really have here, and what kind of expectations are you trying to build in consumers that this digital file is worth something more than the price it's coalescing around?
It's a fair question. When I mentioned that at the summit today, I think the coalescing price is more of an average price, although I think you can see Amazon pricing almost every bestseller at $9.99. There are a large variety of titles that are priced above $9.99 and many that are priced below $9.99. I still think you're going to find price variability in digital formats because honestly, if we're publishing Roger Penrose's Mathematics of Physics at 600 pages, with a ton of content in there, that's not a $9 book or a $10 book. It never will be digitally or in print. But if we're doing a 192-page category romance, that may not be a $10 book either. It may go the other way. So there's enough difference in the content. These aren't like songs where they're typically one length, and even songs now you can see that iTunes has basically agreed to break the 99-cent model, and they now have $1.29 for certain songs and 99 for others, and 79 cents for others. So I think we're in a place where it's not going to be a single price point for the publishing industry. I don't fear that. I do actually support, to some extent, consumers understanding what the prices are and understanding that they are a good value in the electronic formats. In other words, I would hate to have everything priced at $30 for an electronic book and have people think, hey, $30, I'm just not willing to pay that. Let me find out if there's an illegal way I can get this thing for free. Mm-hmm. We really have to establish consumer behavior, a habit of consumer behavior that's legitimate here, because like all media, the book industry has this, the television industry is going to have this, the music industry's already had this. You have a kind of Scylla and Charybdis. You have two really bad outcomes on either side you're trying to navigate through. The Scylla is piracy, which means everything is going to be free. There's really no industry left. The Charybdis on this side is you're pricing too high and you're going to force people over this way. So you have to have enough revenue volume to maintain your industry. So you can't price too low, because then you have no industry left. There's no money for the creators. They stop creating. But you can't price so high that you're forcing them to the other side. You have to navigate this thing very, very carefully. I think over time the music industry has kind of come back and is going to get it right. I hope the book industry gets it right from the beginning, and when we get into movies and television and other kinds of media, I hope they're able to navigate this fairly well as well, because the outcome here is a very negative outcome if we get it wrong. And that is that if there's really no economics in these creative content industries, there are going to be no industries, which means the best creative talents and minds that we have are not going to, they're not going to find this to be a particularly attractive industry to participate in. So we really need to make sure that consumers, whether this is through copyright enforcement or education or other reasons, or other methods, that consumers understand the value of content. They don't expect it to be free. They're comfortable with purchase mechanisms that actually work for them and deliver value to them. And I would submit that Sony's Reader and Amazon's Kindle are examples of that in the book business, and there are other examples, and plenty of them, in the music business as well now.
Well, Mr. Sarnoff, is the Google book settlement a way to navigate between the piracy and the too high prices?
Yes, I believe it is. The Google settlement, which is a settlement between the authors, represented by the Authors Guild, the publishing industry, represented by the American Association of Publishers, and Google itself, and on the side, the libraries from which Google copied all of these materials, is an important settlement as a kind of precedent for our media markets here, because it does allow for a brand new market to kind of come out of nowhere for the content creators and for publishers and for Google, frankly. In other words, they were engaging in a behavior which we, from a copyright standpoint, thought was illegal. They were copying books in libraries, and they were taking those copies and making snippets out of them so people could find the books, and they were giving copies back to the libraries. All of this copying is exactly what copyright is about, in our view. That you really can't make copies of these whole works for any commercial purposes whatsoever without the permission of the rights holders. So we engaged in a lawsuit that ended up being a class action. The authors but a class action format of a lawsuit, and we joined in that, and together we sat around a table, and this wasn't quick, it took years, and tried to figure out how could we take this situation, which is going to end badly for all of us. In other words, if Google had won the day, what it would be able to do then is take all of these books, copy them, give copies back to the libraries to do with what they wanted to do, and then serve out snippets to the public to show what pieces of these books were to the public. So you could search and find little pieces of your books. That's all they would be able to do, however, and we viewed that as unlikely because we thought we had the better of the argument that no, they would be prevented from doing such a thing. They would not be able to make these copies and make them available and snippetize them for the public. But that's a loss for us too, because what these guys were digitizing and have digitized, millions of books already, are many, many books that are out of print and essentially inaccessible to the public, inaccessible to researchers at universities, and inaccessible to the world in general. And so at least for the United States, which is the only place the settlement could be effective, if it is approved by the judge, we will allow for all of these books that are digitized to have a kind of new life in our culture, in our society, in our educational institutions, where once digitized, you will be able to have access to these as a consumer and browse them, see if you're interested in buying them, and if so, you can purchase access to them electronically. In the case of institutions, you can get a subscription to all of these works so that your students and faculty have essentially the world's greatest library, in some ways the Library of Alexandria, ultimately. Every book that you could ever want would be available to their students and faculties, not just by going to the library and taking a physical copy out, but in their dorm rooms, in their offices, pulled up by search engines. It would be an absolute revolution of scholarship and a really big sea change for American educational institutions to have that capacity. Married to that, we would create an economic model so that would be available by subscription to these universities, so that all the creators of that content and the publishers of that content can be compensated for these essentially for these subscriptions that the institutions would be engaged in providing to their audiences. That's a brand new market for us and allowed us to do this settlement.
But there have been serious antitrust concerns raised about Google's role in all of this and basically having exclusive rights to all of these books that are in copyright but whose owners can't be found. And this may actually tie up this settlement. It could be the basis for it being rejected with the Justice Department looking at it. And so I'm wondering from you, were these conditions avoidable? Things that have been raised by people who may want to get into the same business Google is in but will be precluded by law because they don't have this same exemption that Google's going to have to provide all these works.
Well, this so-called exemption applies only to works whose owners cannot be found. Any works that are claimed, that is, that we as a publisher claim them or the author claims them, those works can be licensed by the Book Rights Registry to any competitor who would want to provide the same service as Google. You are right when it comes to the so-called orphan works, works that are never claimed by anyone. The class action mechanism gives Google a capacity to do certain things with those works that would be difficult to replicate unless someone else had a similar class action result. Mm-hmm. However, we think that's quite temporary and not particularly meaningful. Let me explain why.
Okay.
Not particularly meaningful. These books that we're talking about, these orphan works, there's a concern that Google will have a monopoly on these works. Well, let me tell you, these works are a no-opoly today. There is no one exploiting these works. There is no one who could possibly exploit these works. These works are sitting there, not findable, in general, not findable, not accessible to anyone. In order to have, in my view, to have Google servicing these works is a societal good, and it's a good for the rights holders. And that's who we're trying to service here. The rights holders, the general public, and of course the communities of scholars that may want access to these works. So the settlement does provide that. The second reason it's not particularly germane is, in my view, the settlement for the first time provides an economic incentive for people to claim these works when they're theirs. Hey, my father wrote this thing a long time ago. I hear there are payments being generated for these old works. I'm going to claim it. So we'll have fewer and fewer of these orphan works over time because there's a mechanism for payment. And the last thing is, and I believe that this will also come to pass, maybe not immediately, but there'll be a renewed legislative impetus to deal with orphan works so that others can be enabled to have these same kinds of licenses that Google has legally without the class action mechanism. That, we couldn't do that as we saw it today, but certainly with the legislative action that could be contemplated, it would be very, very easy to do.
Mr. Sarnoff, why did you say that the benefits of this deal would be limited to the U.S.?
Because this is a U.S. lawsuit, and the only use by whether it's consumers or institutions would be in the U.S. Outside the U.S., none of these files would be usable by anyone, including Google.
Let me ask you about these two differing approaches that have emerged in the print world for dealing with piracy. You have several media organizations who've recently created this group called the Fair Syndication Consortium, who are trying to get basically advertising networks to share some of the revenue that's being generated from the unauthorized use of their articles, their news stories. And on the other side, you have mainly the Associated Press, which is taking much more of a kind of recording industry style campaign to actually go after and try to prosecute some of these places that are running their articles without permission. Do you see either of these approaches as more likely to work? Is there any kind of history from the past 10 years with the recording industry being very proactive versus some of the other copyright industries that have tried to be more cooperative, and as you tried to with Bertelsmann, tried to actually co-opt a pirate service?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated issue. Now, as to, in the news business, as to whether there can be a kind of forced sharing of advertising revenues from sites that are not legitimately paying anyone, I mean, that is a whole enforcement regime that is pretty hard to figure out how it would work. I think it is possible. I'm not sure it will be desirable. I think the more desirable way to go is that the internet, there's actually in the Congress today we had France there, which is pointing in a different direction, which is to say, hey, there's no God-given right that everyone has to use the internet exactly as they wish to use it if it's violating someone else's rights. So therefore, there's certainly possibilities because of the nature of the internet to figure out where all of these things are posted and to make sure that they're posted in, legitimately and sharing revenues legitimately over time. I'm not sure either of the two extremes that you outlined are the best way to go. And I'm not sure France's methodology of actually withholding internet service for those who engage in piracy and other kinds of things is the right way to go for this country either. But I am sure that there are technical solutions to what is ultimately a technical problem.
And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Greg Piper of Washington Internet Daily, thank you very much. And Mr. Sarnoff, thank you for joining us on the Communicators.
It was a pleasure.
The name Sarnoff is quite familiar and is a name that's known in communications. Why do we know that name?
Well, going back a couple of generations, my grandfather's brother, David Sarnoff, was head of RCA and then established NBC, so he was part of the development of both radio and television, which is why the name is somewhat familiar. I do like to tell the story that he fundamentally got it wrong, along with Marconi and others, which is, as we can now see, television really should go through wires, and telephone should really go through the air. And so they essentially had it slightly reversed, but it worked for many decades, and he was a great man.
Richard Sarnoff is co-chair of the Bertelsmann Corporation. Thank you.
Thank you.